Richard, if I can start with tariffs, because obviously that's really on everyone's mind at the moment, with August 1 having passed and a whole bunch of new numbers. But really in New Zealand, there's a lot of concern because we've copped this 15% base tariff as opposed to Australia, which has actually got 10%. How are you reading that, and how worried do you think we should be about that?
Everyone should be worried about the tariffs. It doesn't strike me New Zealand should be especially worried. Obviously, there's a difference between 15 and 10, but New Zealand exports about $8 billion a year to the US on a $400 billion economy. To do a quick bit of math, that's 2%, 15% on 2%. It doesn't strike me as a really macroeconomically relevant number. Obviously, for the firms and sectors which export, it's a challenge. And it's another challenge on top of higher technology costs, difficulty accessing the right labour at the right price in certain segments, perhaps more competition, maybe medium-term concerns about structural Chinese economic slowdown. So I think it's less about the 15% and more about the 15% and the list.
I guess what you're saying there is that a concern for the actual exporters, but you're confident that New Zealand, when you look at the macro story for New Zealand, that we can absorb that it's not going to be on your top of your list of things we should be worrying about?
Look, lower interest rates are a powerful tonic. New Zealand's economy had a pretty difficult year in 2024, but 2025 is stronger so far, and our view is will continue to improve into 2026. The challenges are slower burn and more structural. I think the fact we're in a world of more geostrategic competition. Tariffs are a byproduct of that. Industry policy with different economies seeking to build domestic advantage also imposes costs on third economies like New Zealand. The fact China increasingly does have a bit of a kind of structural, slower, weaker, kind of slowflation story. I think all of these things are headwinds over time, not acute, but more chronic, I think.
Yeah. So when you look at the tariffs more broadly and what they're doing to the global economy, I mean, I guess that's where the other impact would be on New Zealand, is if it slows the global economy. What's your view currently on how the global economy is tracking in the wake of what's happening with tariffs?
So the global economy last year did about 3.3. This year we anticipate about 3. So certainly a slowdown that you can see in the data, but still just a modest slowdown. And maybe to put 3% for the global economy in context, global population growth is about 1. A global recession is global GDP growth below population growth. We're a long way from global recession, even though it has become a more challenging environment, and tariffs are contributing to that global slowdown.
Sure. You're in New Zealand this week, obviously getting a chance to talk to a lot of people. My sense is that the narrative's got a bit gloomy again. People felt that we sort of stalled a bit in the second quarter. And I'm just wondering, from an external point of view, looking at it from Sydney, how do you view where New Zealand's at in its economic cycle at the moment?
Well, I think there's two things going on. One is the benefit of lower interest rates starting to come through, and you saw that early in things like business confidence, and it's clearly also started to feed through to activity, even though it has been a bit bumpy. And I think the second issue is the tonic of lower rates, but in a world which has become more complex, where supply side pressures have continued to ramp up. And I think that both of those things are likely to mean that the recovery will be bumpy and kind of gradual.
Yeah, so it's just taking longer than people would have liked, I guess, is the thing that's sort of getting under people's skin. And we're also seeing a little bit of food price inflation, and that's making people sort of worry about whether inflation's back. I mean, you're not too concerned about that top line sort of stuff?
Look, I think we need to differentiate between price pressure and measured inflation. I know that sounds a bit esoteric, but they are quite important. I do think there is price pressure, but when interest rates are at the levels that they are still in most economies, i.e. higher than pre-pandemic and materially higher, I think higher prices often feed through into weaker demand. The US perhaps is a strong example of that. So measured inflation, I don't think is at risk of picking up materially, but somebody has to pay the higher cost.
Yeah, I mean, I know ANZ has a view that there will be some more, Reserve Bank will be making some more cuts to the official cash rate. Do you sort of see that as, when you talk about inflation in that way, that there is scope for further cutting for the.
It would be odd in a global easing cycle if New Zealand started to go the other way. I mean, it has happened before, but I think the fact, it was a very synchronised tightening cycle. It's been a synchronised mid-cycle easing. I mean, I know New Zealand's flirted with recession on a couple of occasions, but they've been shallow experiences, so they're still painful, but they're not too damaging, certainly not of the sort of recessions we saw perhaps 10 or 15 years ago globally.
Sure.
I think that's consistent with rates gradually coming down a bit further.
Talking about being in sync or with cycles, how are you viewing Australia at the moment? How is that sort of measuring up with where New Zealand's at in its recovery cycle?
New Zealand, I think, slowed more quickly and more sharply, partly at least because of a stronger and more aggressive tightening cycle. In Australia, the slowdown was more modest as a result, but also the pickup's also been quite gradual. In New Zealand, in some sectors, I think there's been a more defined pickup, whereas Australia's still kind of working its way through, I think. And this other challenge in Australia is prevalent as well. Still seeing some pricing pressure in certain segments, particularly in services, maybe healthcare, insurance as some prominent examples. That's not increasing measured inflation, but what it is putting more pressure on consumers, and they're cutting spending on other things.
That's sort of a reasonably upbeat message on New Zealand that it's taking its time, but you do see the cyclical recovery starting to take hold. Is that
monetary
correct?
Policy works.
Yeah. To step back a bit further, then you mentioned structural issues. What are the more the longer term structural issues that you see with the New Zealand economy?
Demographics is a big challenge. It's a big challenge for everybody. Us immigrant economies have had an advantage in a demographically ageing world, but the birth rate in New Zealand is well below 2. I think 1.6% was the last numbers I looked at. That puts even more reliance on migration, but obviously the intersection between stronger population growth, wherever it comes from, and housing affordability has become just a more dominant concern across the entire developed world. And obviously, as a small open economy with a high export to GDP ratio, about a quarter of GDP is exported out of New Zealand, in a world that's just becoming, separating a little bit more, certainly more than we're used to, I think that's a strategic challenge. And I think all small and medium economies need to make greater efforts to build relationships around the world if the largest economy in the world is choosing to separate a bit more.
Just finally then, as you get around, talking to clients and the conference you're going to and things, what's the sort of the big message that you're probably hoping to leave the New Zealanders with from this visit?
Well, for me, the two big messages are monetary policy works. It's darkest before the dawn. I think the economy is definitely showing signs of stabilising, and some sectors are picking up, and we expect the rest to materially follow over the course of the next year or so. But the second issue is I think these supply side pressures are likely to remain, and in fact think about tariffs as a supply side problem rather than materially raising the risk of global recession. I think if you excessively worry about global recession, i.e. weaker demand, you'll miss out on the opportunities that are there.
Right. No, thanks. That's great. Cheers.
Thank you.